In the English countryside, 40 miles northwest of London, stands a house that was built to project power, while conducting business in the shadows. Waddesdon Manor rises from Buckinghamshire in golden stone, its French Renaissance facade concealing telegraph wires and private courier networks that once connected it to Vienna, Paris, Naples, and London. The Rothschilds who built this place understood something their competitors did not. A palace is also a vault. Art is also liquidity. And every dinner party can be an intelligence operation. The family that financed the defeat of Napoleon did not stop at baking. They built an empire of mansions that functioned as nerve centers of European finance for 200 years, and the true purpose of those gilded rooms remained hidden until the system itself collapsed. This is the story of how the Rothschild banking dynasty turned architecture into infrastructure, and how the most beautiful buildings in Europe were also its most effective business tools. Subscribe now if you enjoy these stories, and let's dive into it. On a narrow street in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter, 1744, a boy was born who would reshape European finance. The Judengasse was less a neighborhood than a legally enforced ghetto. High walls confined Frankfurt's Jewish population to a single cramped lane, where more than 3,000 people lived under conditions designed to humiliate. Jews could not own land outside the quarter. They could not practice most trades. They paid special taxes for the privilege of existing. When darkness fell, iron gates locked them inside. Meyer Amschel Rothschild grew up in this world of enforced scarcity and systematic contempt. His father dealt in coins and traded currency, one of the few professions open to Jews in 18th century Frankfurt. When Meyer Amschel was born on February 23, 1744, nothing about his circumstances suggested the empire that would follow. The family lived above their shop in quarters that were modest even by ghetto standards. The street outside was so narrow that two carts could barely pass each other. When his father died in 1755, Meyer inherited the business. He was 11 years old. What happened next has been told so often that myth has obscured fact, but the outline remains clear. The boy possessed a talent for understanding what powerful men wanted. Coins were not just currency to 18th century aristocrats. They were history made tangible. Prestige you could hold in your palm, a way to demonstrate cultivation and wealth simultaneously. Meyer learned to source rare specimens. He studied their history, their minting, their provenance. He became an expert in numismatics at an age when most boys were still apprentices. More importantly, he learned to speak to collectors in their own language, to educate while he sold, to make each transaction feel like a partnership rather than commerce. By his 20s, Meyer had attracted the attention of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest rulers in German lands. Wilhelm collected coins with the obsessive precision of a man who had unlimited funds and limited outlets for ambition. He needed suppliers who could find what others could not. Meyer Amschel provided exactly that. The relationship began with numismatics and expanded into banking. Wilhelm's wealth came from an unusual source. He rented Hessian soldiers to foreign powers, particularly Britain, which needed troops for its colonial wars. The business was lucrative and morally uncomplicated by the standards of the time. Wilhelm accumulated capital faster than he could deploy it domestically. He needed bankers who could move money across borders, invest it discreetly, and generate returns without requiring his constant attention. Meyer Amschel, still operating from the Frankfurt Ghetto, became one of those bankers. The work required skills that Jews had developed through centuries of exclusion from other occupations. Moving money across borders meant building networks of trust that transcended national boundaries. Investing discreetly meant understanding which ventures would succeed and which would collapse. Generating returns meant taking calculated risks that traditional institutions avoided. Meyer Amschel was methodical in all of this. He kept meticulous records. He honored every commitment. He expanded slowly, building relationships rather than pursuing quick profits. By the 1790s, his firm was handling significant portions of Wilhelm's fortune. Then he made the decision that would create a dynasty. Mayor Amschel had 5 sons and 5 daughters. In 1798, he began sending his sons to establish banking operations in other cities. The strategy was deliberate and unprecedented. Each son would operate independently, but coordinate with his brothers. Each would cultivate relationships with local rulers and merchants. Each would specialize in the financial needs of his particular city, while maintaining absolute loyalty to the family interest. Amschel Mayer, the eldest, remained in Frankfurt to manage the original firm. Salomon Mayer went to Vienna. Nathan Mayer went to Manchester, then London. Kalman Mayer went to Naples. James Mayer went to Paris. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 unified enterprise. The timing aligned perfectly with European chaos. The French Revolution had destabilized traditional banking houses. The Napoleonic Wars that followed created unprecedented demand for the movement of capital across hostile borders. Governments needed loans to finance armies. Merchants needed to move goods through blockades. Families needed to protect wealth from confiscation. The Rothschild brothers provided all of these services. Their advantage was structural. Traditional banks operated within single nations and faced legal restrictions on cross-border activity. The Rothschilds operated as a family network that transcended national boundaries. When Napoleon's armies occupied Frankfurt, Salomon continued operations from Vienna. When British blockades strangled trade with France, James in Paris coordinated with Nathan in London to move goods through neutral territories. The system was not legal in the conventional sense. It was not illegal either. It existed in the spaces between national jurisdictions, exploiting the fact that laws ended at borders, while family loyalty did not. The most famous story from this period involves Nathan Rothschild and the Battle of Waterloo. According to legend, Nathan received news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government. He used that advance knowledge to manipulate the bond market, first selling British bonds to create panic, then buying them at collapsed prices before the official news arrived. When Wellington's victory was confirmed, Nathan's holdings soared in value. The story is probably false in its details. Modern historians have examined Nathan's trading records and found no evidence of the dramatic manipulation described in popular accounts. But the legend persists because it captures a deeper truth. The Rothschilds did possess superior intelligence networks. They did use information as a financial weapon, and they did emerge from the Napoleonic Wars as one of the dominant banking powers in Europe. What is documented beyond dispute is their role in financing Wellington's army. Moving gold from London to the British forces in Portugal and Spain required coordination across hostile territory, knowledge of secure routes, and relationships with merchants who could convert currency at favorable rates. Nathan Rothschild managed this operation with such efficiency that Wellington later credited him with enabling the final campaigns against Napoleon. By 1815, the Rothschild family bank was handling loans for multiple governments simultaneously. They financed Prussia's war indemnity to France. They funded Austria's reconstruction. They managed British gold reserves. The scale of their operations exceeded any private banking house in history, and they were just beginning. The 5 brothers understood something their competitors did not. Lending to governments created leverage that transcended finance. A nation in debt to the Rothschilds needed to maintain good relations with the family. Ministers who wanted loans had to grant concessions. Policies that threatened Rothschild interests faced quiet but effective opposition. This was not corruption in the crude sense. It was something more subtle and more powerful. The Rothschilds had made themselves indispensable. Governments could function without them, but not as efficiently, not as cheaply, not with the same access to international markets. By the 1820s, the family was pursuing a new strategy. They began building, not just offices, but residences of unprecedented scale and grandeur. The mansions would announce their arrival as European powers, while serving purposes far beyond residential comfort. The first generation had worked from cramped quarters in the Frankfurt Ghetto and rented rooms in foreign cities. The second generation would operate from palaces that rivaled anything the aristocracy could build. The boy who inherited his father's coin shop at age 11 died in 1812, before the full scope of his achievement became visible. But Mayor Amschel Rothschild left instructions that would govern the family for generations. His sons must remain united. The business must stay in family hands. Daughters would receive dowries, but no ownership stake. Sons-in-law would be excluded from management. The rules were rigid and patriarchal by any standard. They were also effective. The Rothschild Bank would remain a family enterprise, while competitors fragmented across generations. Mayor Amschel's sons inherited an institution, not just a business. Now they would build the infrastructure to match their ambitions. The family that financed empires would need homes worthy of emperors. What they built was far more than that. By the 1850s, the Rothschilds were building, not offices or warehouses, but residences that announced their arrival as European powers. The mansions rose across the continent in a coordinated campaign that mirrored the banking strategy itself. Each brother would construct a statement in his adopted city. Each would hire the finest architects available. Each would fill his home with art that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The first major project began in England in 1850. Baron Mayor Amschel de Rothschild, Nathan's son, commissioned the construction of Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire. He hired Joseph Paxton, the architect who had designed the Crystal Palace, for the Great Exhibition of 1851. Paxton created a Jacobean Revival palace that covered more than 80,000 square feet. The central hall rose 3 stories beneath a glazed roof that flooded the space with light. The staircase was modeled after one in the Château de Blois in France. The house required a staff of more than 60 servants to operate. The grounds extended across thousands of acres. The stables held dozens of horses. The wine cellar could accommodate 20,000 bottles. Baron Mayor filled Mentmore with one of the finest private art collections in England. Renaissance paintings hung in the galleries. French furniture from the 18th century filled the state rooms. Sèvres porcelain lined entire walls. The collection was catalogued with the precision of a museum, each piece documented by provenance and value. This was not decoration for its own sake. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every ceramic vase represented portable wealth. In times of crisis, art could be moved, hidden, or sold more easily than land or buildings. The Rothschilds had learned this lesson during the Napoleonic Wars, when they moved valuables across borders ahead of advancing armies. In France, Baron James de Rothschild began planning an even more ambitious project. In 1855, he purchased an estate at Ferrières-en-Brie, 16 miles east of Paris. He hired the architect Joseph Paxton again, but this time the inspiration was purely French. Ferrières would be a Renaissance chateau on a scale that rivaled Versailles. Construction took nearly a decade. The completed mansion contained more than 80 rooms arranged around a central hall that rose 60 feet beneath a glazed dome. The staterooms were paneled in carved oak. The galleries displayed paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Watteau. The gardens extended across 7,400 acres of formerly landscaped grounds. When Napoleon III visited Ferrières in December 1862, he reportedly said to his host, "Kings could not afford this. It could only belong to a Rothschild." The comment was meant as praise. It was also an acknowledgement of changed circumstances. The family that had financed Napoleon's uncle now possessed wealth that exceeded the French crowns. In Vienna, the Rothschilds built differently. Baron Salomon had established the Austrian branch of the family bank. In 1820, his son, Baron Anselm, built a palace on the Ringstrasse that reflected Viennese taste. Palais Rothschild, completed in 1865, rose 4 stories in French Renaissance style. The facade was relatively restrained by the standards of the family's other projects. The interior was not. The Great Hall featured a double staircase of white marble imported from Carrara. The ballroom could accommodate 400 guests. The picture gallery displayed works by Titian, Velázquez, and other masters. Baron Anselm's collection eventually included more than 1,000 paintings. In England, Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild surpassed even meant more. Waddesdon Manor, begun in 1874, took nearly a decade to complete. Ferdinand hired Gabriel Hippolyte d'Estailleur, a French architect who had specialized in restoring Loire Valley chateaux. The commission was to build a French Renaissance palace on a hilltop in Buckinghamshire that had previously supported only farmland. The site required extensive engineering. The hilltop had to be flattened and regraded. A private railway was constructed to transport bathstone from quarries 100 miles away. Mature trees were transplanted to create the appearance of established grounds. A steam-powered tramway hauled materials up the steep approach roads. The completed house rose in golden stone, its towers and turrets echoing Chambord and Blois. The interiors combined French boiserie panels from demolished Parisian mansions with English craftsmanship. Ferdinand filled 40 rooms with French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, and paintings by Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Romney. The wine cellar held 15,000 bottles. The estate employed more than 200 staff members. These were not isolated projects. Between 1850 and 1900, the Rothschild family constructed or acquired more than 40 major residences across Europe. Güntersburg in Frankfurt, Schillersdorf in Silesia, Villa Rothschild in Preny, Switzerland, the Château de Boulogne in Paris. Each announced the family's status. Each served functions beyond residential comfort. The locations were strategic. Mentmore sat 40 miles from London, close enough for day trips to the city, but far enough to function as a retreat where business could be conducted away from the scrutiny of Parliament and press. Ferrières was positioned similarly relative to Paris. Waddesdon commanded the railway line between London and Birmingham, making it accessible to both financial and industrial centers. The guest lists were even more strategic. When monarchs visited Ferrières or Waddesdon, they came not just for hunting and dinner, but for consultations about state loans and bond issues. Railroad magnates who needed financing for expansion projects received invitations to weekend parties where informal conversations preceded formal negotiations. Rival bakers were invited to see the scale of Rothschild operations and understand that competition was futile. The architecture itself communicated power. A visitor approaching Waddesdon by carriage in 1890 would see the chateau rising from the hilltop long before arrival. The approach was designed to impress and intimidate simultaneously. By the time guests reached the entrance, they understood they were entering not just a home, but a seat of financial empire. The staff infrastructure supported this dual function. At Ferrières, Baron James maintained a private telegraph office connected directly to his Paris headquarters and to his brother's offices in London, Vienna, and Naples. Encrypted messages traveled constantly between the mansions and the banking houses. Couriers arrived at all hours carrying documents too sensitive for telegraph transmission. The stables were not merely for leisure riding. They provided horses for rapid dispatch of messages and maintained carriages for urgent travel to railway stations. At Waddesdon, Baron Ferdinand constructed a private rail siding that allowed direct train access to the estate. Visitors could arrive without passing through public stations where their presence might be noted. The art collection served multiple purposes simultaneously. Paintings and furniture represented stored wealth that could be liquidated during financial crises. They also functioned as social currency. Lending pieces to museums or exhibitions built goodwill with institutions and governments. Displaying them to visitors established the family's cultural credentials and softened their image as mere financiers. The scale of these collections was extraordinary. By 1900, the Rothschild family collectively owned one of the largest private art collections in the world. Paintings by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Watteau, Gainsborough, and Reynolds hung in multiple Rothschild residences. Entire rooms were devoted to Sèvres porcelain. Libraries contained first editions and medieval manuscripts. This was wealth made visible and portable. Land could be confiscated. Buildings could be seized. But art could be hidden, moved across borders, or sold to raise capital when needed. The Rothschilds had learned this lesson repeatedly across generations of European conflict. The mansions also employed hundreds of workers directly and supported thousands more indirectly. At Waddesdon, the staff included gardeners, gamekeepers, stable hands, housekeepers, cooks, footmen, and ladies' maids. The estate purchased supplies from local merchants. It provided employment in a rural area where alternatives were limited. This created dependencies. Communities that relied on Rothschild employment were unlikely to support political movements hostile to the family. Workers who drew wages from the estates had reasons to defend their patrons against criticism. By 1890, the pattern was complete. The Rothschild banking empire operated from headquarters disguised as pleasure palaces. Telegraph wires ran beneath formal gardens. Couriers moved constantly between mansions and exchanges. Weekend parties doubled as business conferences. Art collections functioned as liquid reserves. The system was legal, effective, and almost invisible to outsiders who saw only the beauty and assumed it existed for aesthetic pleasure alone. The mansions were complete. Now the real work could begin. A weekend party at Waddesdon Manor in November 1895. A WM 1895 illustrates how the system functioned. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild hosted the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, along with several cabinet ministers, 2 railway executives, and a banking rival from the Barings family. The guest list appeared social. The conversations were anything but. Friday evening began with dinner in the state dining room beneath Gainsborough portraits and Sèvres chandeliers. Seating arrangements were precise. Lord Salisbury sat between Ferdinand and the Barings representative. Railway executives flanked the cabinet ministers. After dinner, the men retired to the smoking room, while ladies withdrew to the drawing room. These were not social calls. They were transactions. In the smoking room, over brandy and cigars, Lord Salisbury mentioned that the government was considering a loan to finance naval expansion. The terms had not been finalized. The Barings representative expressed interest in leading the syndicate. Ferdinand said nothing, but listened carefully to every detail discussed. Saturday brought shooting on the estate. Beaters drove pheasants toward the guns, while servants followed with refreshments. During breaks, Ferdinand walked with individual guests, conducting quiet conversations that appeared casual, but covered bond rates, railway concessions, and political developments in France and Austria. By Sunday morning, Ferdinand knew exactly what loan terms the government required, what the Barings family was prepared to offer, and which ministers favored which approach. Monday, he would telegraph his cousin Nathaniel in London with detailed instructions. By Tuesday, the Rothschild Bank would submit a proposal that undercut Barings while satisfying every government requirement that Lord Salisbury had mentioned over brandy. The Barings representative never knew he had been invited to reveal his strategy. This pattern repeated across the network of Rothschild mansions. At Ferrières, Baron Alphonse hosted similar gatherings for French ministers and industrialists. At the Vienna palaces, Baron Albert entertained Habsburg officials and railroad developers. Every weekend, every dinner party, every hunting expedition generated intelligence that flowed through telegraph lines to banking offices in 5 cities. The telegraph rooms themselves were remarkable installations. At Ferrières, the telegraph office occupied a ground-floor room near Baron Alphonse's private study. It connected directly to the Rothschild Bank in Paris and through encrypted relay stations to London, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. Operators worked in shifts, ensuring 24-hour coverage. Messages arrived in code that only family members and senior managers could decrypt. The codes were sophisticated for their time. Commodities, currencies, and political figures had numerical designations that changed monthly. Simple substitution ciphers protected routine communications. More sensitive information used polyalphabetic encryption that would take competitors weeks to break. By the time they succeeded, the information would be obsolete. Speed mattered as much as secrecy. A message from financiers could reach London in under 2 hours, Vienna in 4, Naples in 6. Compare this to conventional mail, which took days, or to competitors who relied on couriers and commercial telegraph services where messages could be read by operators or intercepted by rivals. The Rothschilds had essentially built a private communications network that gave them hours or days of advantage over every other banking house in Europe. Art served this system in ways that visitors never suspected. The paintings hanging in Waddesdon's galleries represented approximately $2 million in portable assets by 1900 valuations. During market panics or political crises, selected pieces could be quietly sold to raise immediate capital. The sales would be handled through dealers in Paris or London, never locally where they might signal distress. In 1890, when the Barings Bank nearly collapsed during the Argentine debt crisis, the Rothschilds were among the few institutions with sufficient liquid reserves to participate in the rescue syndicate. Part of that liquidity came from art sales executed months earlier, when Ferdinand had sensed instability in South American bonds. He had sold 3 paintings through a Paris dealer, raising $180,000. The sales went unnoticed. The cash was available when needed. The mansions also functioned as intimidation. When competitors visited Waddesdon or financiers, they saw the scale of Rothschild operations made physical. The art collection alone exceeded the total capital of most regional banks. The staff numbered in the hundreds. The grounds stretched for thousands of acres. The message was clear without being stated. This family operates at a level you cannot match. Baron Ferdinand understood this psychological dimension completely. He once wrote to his cousin Nathaniel that the purpose of Waddesdon was not comfort, but communication. Every detail of the house, and grounds was designed to demonstrate that the Rothschilds had achieved permanence that transcended ordinary commerce. The hunting parties served similar purposes. Ferdinand maintained one of the finest shoots in England, with tens of thousands of pheasants raised annually specifically to be driven toward guests' guns. Politicians who might hesitate to accept cash gifts or obvious favors would gladly accept invitations to shoot. Once on the estate, they were isolated from their usual advisors and exposed to Rothschild perspectives on every policy issue affecting banking and trade. Records from the estate show that between 1883 and 1898, Waddesdon hosted more than 30 cabinet-level government ministers, 8 foreign ambassadors, and representatives from every major banking house in Europe. Similar patterns emerged at other Rothschild properties. The system extended beyond social manipulation into direct market intervention. In January 1875, Baron Lionel de Rothschild learned through his intelligence network that the Khedive of Egypt needed to sell his shares in the Suez Canal Company to cover debts. The information came via telegraph from Alphonse in Paris, who had heard it from an Egyptian official at a dinner party at Ferrières 3 weeks earlier. Lionel moved immediately. He contacted Prime Minister Disraeli and offered to advance the British government $4 million to purchase the shares before any other power could act. The deal was concluded in less than 48 hours. Britain gained strategic control of the Suez Canal. The Rothschilds gained both profit and political leverage with the government. The transaction would not have been possible without the intelligence network that ran through the mansions. Traditional banking houses learned about the Khedive's situation days or weeks later, by which time the opportunity had vanished. Contemporary observers noticed the pattern but struggled to document it. French journalist Edouard Drumont wrote in 1886 that the Rothschilds possessed an invisible empire that operated through country houses and dinner parties where real power was exercised far from parliamentary oversight. His accusations were mixed with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that obscured legitimate observations about concentrated financial power. British financial papers noted repeatedly that Rothschild loan terms seemed impossibly informed about government requirements and competitor offers. How did the family consistently submit proposals that were neither too aggressive nor too conservative, but precisely calibrated to win without leaving money on the table? The answer was visible to anyone who examined guest lists and telegraph traffic, but proving coordination was another matter entirely. The mansions were private property. Dinner conversations were privileged. Telegraph messages were encrypted. And nothing the family did violated any law. They had simply built a system that allowed 5 brothers and their descendants to function as a single coordinated entity across national boundaries, while competitors remained fragmented by those same boundaries. By 1900, the Rothschild network included more than 40 major residences, dozens of telegraph offices, hundreds of staff members trained in discretion, and a communication system that could move information across Europe faster than any government or commercial enterprise could match. The mansions that appeared to be monuments to wealth were actually nodes in a financial intelligence network that had no equal in private hands. Observers noticed the pattern. Some tried to expose it. One succeeded. By the 1870s, questions were being asked. Financial journalists documented patterns they could not fully explain. Members of Parliament demanded investigations into banking practices that seemed to transcend national boundaries. Competitors filed complaints alleging market manipulation, and beneath all legitimate criticism ran a darker current of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that weaponized real financial coordination into racist fantasy. The Rothschilds responded with silence, philanthropy, and continued expansion. In France, Jory, Callan, Jones, journalist Edouard Drumont published La France Juive in 1886, a 2-volume work that became one of the most widely read books in late 19th century France. Drumont documented real Rothschild banking practices, the coordinated loan offerings, the intelligence networks, the influence over government policy, and then embedded these facts within anti-Semitic conspiracy theories alleging Jewish plots to dominate Christian nations. The book sold more than 100,000 copies in its first year. It spawned imitators across Europe. Drumont's techniques became a template for how factual observation could be distorted into racist propaganda. He would cite legitimate business transactions, then attribute them to racial characteristics rather than strategic coordination. He would document actual political influence, then claim it proved ancient conspiracies rather than modern financial power. This pattern would persist for decades. Legitimate criticisms of concentrated financial power became impossible to separate from bigotry. Anyone questioning Rothschild practices risked being lumped with anti-Semites. The family gained a perverse protection from their critics' prejudices, but some investigations operated on firmer ground. In Britain, parliamentary inquiries examined banking practices repeatedly between 1875 and 1900. Committees questioned how the Rothschilds consistently secured government loan contracts at terms that undercut competitors while remaining profitable. How did they know exactly what other banks would bid? How did they coordinate offers across borders when doing so was legally ambiguous? Baron Lionel de Rothschild testified before one such committee in 1876. His answers were precise, limited, and revealed nothing. Asked about coordination with his cousins in Paris and Vienna, he explained that family members sometimes consulted on business matters through correspondence. Asked about intelligence gathering at social events, he expressed confusion about what intelligence might mean in this context. Asked about telegraph usage, he confirmed that the bank employed modern communications, but saw nothing unusual in that. The committee found no evidence of illegal activity. Private correspondence was protected. Social conversations were not subject to regulation. Telegraph usage was unrestricted. Everything the Rothschilds did fell within legal boundaries, even if the cumulative effect gave them advantages that seemed unfair. Austria, government officials, grew concerned about the family's influence over railway development. Baron Anselm's Vienna Bank had financed most major Austrian railway construction since the 1840s. Competitors alleged that routes were awarded based on Rothschild preference rather than economic merit. Parliamentary deputies demanded investigations. The investigations revealed extensive Rothschild involvement in railway policy, but nothing prosecutable. Yes, Baron Anselm entertained railway ministers at his palace. Yes, his bank provided generous loans to officials who supported Rothschild-backed routes. Yes, competing proposals often failed to secure financing, even when technically superior. Was this corruption? The legal standard was unclear. Austrian law prohibited direct bribery, but said nothing about entertainment, hospitality, or preferential lending. The Rothschilds had made themselves indispensable to Austrian infrastructure development. Challenging them meant risking delays in the railway expansion that Austria needed to remain competitive with Prussia and Russia. The government issued reports criticizing banking influence over public policy. Nothing changed. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck viewed the Rothschilds with suspicion that mixed legitimate concern with anti-Semitic prejudice. He understood that their cross-border coordination gave them power that transcended Prussian control. He resented their influence over smaller German states that borrowed from Rothschild banks, rather than Berlin. He blamed them when his preferred policies faced financial obstacles, but Bismarck also needed them. Prussian expansion required capital. The Rothschilds could provide it faster and cheaper than alternatives. When Bismarck unified Germany in 1871, Rothschild banks helped finance the consolidation. The Chancellor's personal feelings mattered less than financial necessity. The legal ambiguity extended to nearly every aspect of Rothschild operations. Were the 5 banking houses separate entities or a unified firm? Corporate law in the 1870s provided no clear answer. Each operated under different national charters. Each had distinct shareholders, but they coordinated so closely that they functioned as a single enterprise. Were they a monopoly? That term implied control over a specific commodity or market. The Rothschilds did not monopolize banking. Dozens of other houses competed successfully. What they monopolized was international coordination itself, the ability to move capital and information across borders faster than nation-states could regulate. Contemporary legal frameworks had no category for this kind of power. The mansions epitomized the ambiguity. Waddesdon was Baron Ferdinand's private home, legally protected from government intrusion. That it contained a telegraph office connecting to banking operations in 5 countries was Ferdinand's business. That cabinet ministers visited regularly was social activity between private citizens. That loans were discussed during these visits violated no law. When financial journalist Walter Begehart wrote about the Rothschilds in 1873, he struggled to explain their operations within existing frameworks. They were not exactly a bank, not exactly a trading house, not exactly a diplomatic service, but something of all 3 combined. Begehart concluded that the family had created a new form of institution that transcended conventional categories. The observation was accurate, but provided no basis for regulation. Critics faced another obstacle. The Rothschilds were genuinely effective at what they did. Their loans were repaid reliably. Their bond offerings attracted investors. Their railway financing produced functioning railways. Governments that borrowed from them received better terms than they could secure elsewhere. The system worked, even if it concentrated enormous power in private hands. Edouard Drumon's anti-Semitic attacks actually strengthened the family's position among elites who needed their services. Politicians might privately agree that Rothschild influence had grown excessive, but publicly siding with Drumont meant embracing obvious bigotry. Better to work with the family and secure favorable loan terms than join a racist campaign. The Rothschilds understood this dynamic and exploited it strategically. They increased charitable giving in every country where they operated. Baron Edmund de Rothschild funded Jewish settlement in Palestine. Baron Ferdinand donated art to British museums. The Vienna Rothschilds endowed hospitals. The Paris family supported orphanages and schools. Philanthropy served multiple purposes. It generated positive press coverage that counterbalanced criticism. It created constituencies that defended the family. Hospital administrators, museum curators, educators who depended on Rothschild funding. And it allowed the family to position themselves as benefactors rather than financiers, generous patrons rather than calculating bakers. Most importantly, it was sincere. The philanthropic impulse within the family was real, even as it served strategic purposes. This duality made the family harder to attack. Were they exploiters or benefactors? The answer was both, simultaneously, in ways that made simple moral judgments impossible. By 1900, the pattern was established. Governments investigated, journalists documented, competitors complained, anti-Semites fabricated conspiracies. Nothing changed. The Rothschild network of banks and mansions continued operating exactly as before, legal and untouchable and more powerful than any private institution in European history. The system was not corrupt by 19th century standards. It was simply more efficient than anything governments or laws had been designed to address. The investigations failed, but the world was changing in ways no mansion could control. August 1914. War was declared. Within days, the system that had operated across European borders for a century became impossible to maintain. The Rothschild family found itself divided by national allegiances that superseded blood ties. Telegraph lines that had connected the 5 banking houses were severed or monitored by military censors. Coordination became espionage. Family became enemy. Baron Lionel Walter Rothschild in London could not communicate with his cousin Baron Louis de Rothschild in Vienna. Both nations were at war. Any contact between them violated laws against trading with the enemy. The banking network that had functioned as a unified enterprise now operated as hostile fragments. The French branch faced immediate crisis. Baron Edouard de Rothschild was mobilized into the French army. His cousin James Armand served as well. The Paris bank operated with skeleton staff while its leaders fought Germany. Ferrières, the chateau that had hosted emperors and prime ministers, was hastily closed, and its most valuable artworks moved to secure storage. In Vienna, the situation was more complex. Baron Louis maintained operations throughout the war, financing Austrian war bonds and managing the government's desperate attempts to fund a conflict it could not afford. The Vienna palaces remained operational, but their guest lists now consisted entirely of Habsburg officials and German military commanders. The irony escaped no one. A family that had profited from financing all sides of European conflicts now found its members shooting at each other. The London branch prospered. Britain's financial needs were enormous, and the Rothschilds had always been closest to British interests. They helped organize war bond campaigns and facilitated American loans to the Allied powers. Baron Lionel Walter used his influence to support recruitment efforts. The family that had been accused of having no national loyalty demonstrated it emphatically. But the war destroyed something that could not be rebuilt. The assumption that European civilization would maintain certain rules, that families would remain united, that commerce would continue across borders, that wars would be limited affairs, proved catastrophically wrong. The slaughter on the Western Front and the collapse of three empires shattered the 19th century order that had made Rothschild coordination possible. When the war ended in November 1918, the five banking houses still existed. The network connecting them did not. The interwar period brought new threats. Rising nationalism across Europe targeted cosmopolitan banking as unpatriotic. In Germany, anti-Semitic propaganda intensified, blaming Jews for the war's outcome and the economic chaos that followed. The Rothschilds, as the most visible Jewish banking family, became primary targets. The Frankfurt house, where Meyer Amschel had begun the empire in the Jewish ghetto, closed in 1901 after the death of the last direct male heir. The Naples branch had shut down decades earlier. Now only London, Paris, and Vienna remained operational. In Austria, the situation grew precarious. The Habsburg Empire had collapsed. The new Austrian Republic was small, economically devastated, and politically unstable. Baron Louis maintained banking operations. But the glory days when Austrian Rothschilds had financed railways across an empire were finished. The mansions began to feel like anachronisms. Maintaining Waddesdon's staff of 200 became economically questionable. Ferrières required constant investment to prevent decay. The Vienna palaces seemed absurdly grand for a diminished nation. And then came 1933. Adolf Hitler's appointment as German Chancellor marked the beginning of the end for the European Rothschild Empire. The Nazis had made anti-Semitism central to their ideology, and the Rothschilds embodied everything they claimed to oppose: Jewish, international, wealthy, influential. The threat was obvious immediately. Family members in Germany fled within months. Those with Austrian holdings began making contingency plans. But many underestimated how quickly and completely the situation would deteriorate. On March 12, 1938, German forces entered Austria. The Anschluss was accomplished with minimal resistance. Within hours, Nazi officials began seizing Jewish property throughout Vienna. Baron Louis de Rothschild was at his desk in the family's Vienna bank when Gestapo officers arrived. They arrested him on the spot. He was held in prison for more than a year while the Nazis demanded he sign over all Austrian Rothschild assets as ransom for his release. The family negotiated from London and Paris. The Nazis wanted everything: the palaces, the art collections, the industrial holdings, the bank itself. Baron Louis refused to sign. For 14 months he remained imprisoned while his family tried to secure his freedom through diplomatic channels and ransom payments. The Nazis occupied the Vienna palaces immediately. Palais Rothschild on Prince Eugenstrasse became Gestapo headquarters. The rooms where Baron Anselm had entertained Habsburg ministers now held interrogation cells. The ballroom where the Viennese elite had danced hosted Nazi planning sessions for the final solution. The art collections were systematically looted. Paintings by Vermeer and Rembrandt were removed to museums in Berlin or claimed by Nazi officials for private collections. Furniture, porcelain, and sculpture were catalogued and distributed. The libraries were destroyed or sent to Reich research institutes. Thousands of items simply vanished into private hands. In France, the family had more time, but not much more safety. When German forces invaded in May 1940, the Paris Rothschilds fled. Baron Edouard and his immediate family reached England. Others scattered to Switzerland, Portugal, or the United States. Ferrières was occupied by the German military and used as headquarters for local occupation forces. The chateau survived, the war physically intact but spiritually gutted. Nazi officers lived in rooms where Napoleon III had visited. They hunted in forests that Baron James had carefully landscaped. They drank wine from cellars that had held some of the finest vintages in Europe. The estate that had symbolized Rothschild permanence was now a monument to how completely their world had collapsed. The human cost exceeded property losses. Several Rothschild family members died in the Holocaust. Others survived in hiding or exile, their lives permanently disrupted. Employees of the Vienna Bank were murdered. Staff from the palaces disappeared into concentration camps. Baron Louis was finally released from Nazi custody in May 1939 after the family signed over most of the Austrian assets and paid enormous ransoms. He fled to England. The Vienna Bank was dissolved. The palaces were confiscated. More than a century of Austrian Rothschild history was erased in 14 months. Waddesdon survived only because it sat in England beyond Nazi reach. Baron James de Rothschild donated art and valuables to the National Trust for Safekeeping. The mansion itself was requisitioned by the government and used to house evacuated children from London. The staterooms that had hosted cabinet ministers now served as dormitories for refugees from the Blitz. By 1945, when the war finally ended, the Rothschild Empire existed only in fragments. The coordination that had spanned Europe for 150 years was permanently broken. The mansions that had served as nerve centers now stood as monuments to a vanished era. The family had survived. The system had not. What remained would take a different form. The era of private palaces functioning as financial headquarters was finished. The world had changed in ways that made such operations impossible. National governments had grown more powerful. Banking regulation had expanded. International coordination now required legal frameworks, not family networks. The family survived. The empire did not. What remained would take a different form. By 1950, the world had moved on. The mansions that had symbolized financial empire now faced an uncertain future. Some would be preserved. Others would be sold, demolished, or transformed into institutions bearing little resemblance to their original purpose. The family that had built them scattered across continents, managing what remained of their wealth in a world that no longer permitted the kind of coordination that had made them powerful. The first casualty was Mentmore Towers. Baron Mayer Amschel's great Victorian palace stood empty for years after the war. The staff had dispersed. The family could not justify the expense of maintaining 80,000 square feet for occasional visits. In 1977, the contents were auctioned at Sotheby's over 3 days. More than 2,000 lots went under the hammer. Paintings, furniture, porcelain, and objects that had filled the house for a century were dispersed to museums and private collectors worldwide. The house itself was sold in 1974 to the Transcendental Meditation movement. It became a training center for meditation instructors. The staterooms where Baron Mayer had hosted British ministers now held group meditation sessions. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Ferrières survived, but changed fundamentally. The French Rothschilds recovered the chateau after the war and undertook extensive restoration. Damage from the German occupation required years of repair, but the family no longer needed or wanted a residence of that scale. In 1959, Baron Guy de Rothschild donated Ferrières to the University of Paris. The mansion became a conference center and event venue. Today, Ferrières operates as a commercial space. Corporations rent it for retreats and conferences. Wealthy individuals book it for weddings. The staterooms that Napoleon III had toured now host product launches and gala dinners for clients who pay premium rates. The family maintains ownership through a foundation but no longer lives there. The transformation preserved the architecture while erasing its original function entirely. The Vienna palaces met darker fates. Palais Rothschild on Prince Eugenstrasse, which had served as Gestapo headquarters during the war, was returned to the family after Austria regained independence. But the building was irreparably tainted. The rooms where Jews had been interrogated and murdered could not be reclaimed as family residences. In 1954, Baron Louis sold the palace to the Austrian government. It was demolished in 1955. A hotel now occupies the site. Other Vienna properties were similarly lost. Some were sold to cover restitution debts. Others were demolished for urban redevelopment. The Rothschild presence in Vienna, once expressed through multiple grand palaces, was reduced to street names and historical plaques. The banking house never reopened. The family that had financed Austrian railways for a century left no institutional presence. Waddesdon followed a different path. In 1957, Baron James de Rothschild bequeathed the mansion and its contents to the National Trust, with a substantial endowment for maintenance. His will specified that the house should be preserved exactly as the family had arranged it, as a monument to Victorian taste and Rothschild collecting. The National Trust opened Waddesdon to the public in 1959. Visitors could walk through the staterooms, see the French furniture and Sèvres porcelain, and tour the gardens. The transformation from private residence to public museum was complete. The rooms where cabinet ministers had negotiated loans now served tourists who paid admission fees. The wine cellars were maintained and eventually became a commercial operation. The Rothschild wine business, particularly Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton in Bordeaux, survived as one of the family's most visible enterprises. But wine production was lifestyle business, not the foundation of financial power. It represented what the family had become, wealthy proprietors managing inherited assets, not coordinators of international finance. The banking operations evolved more subtly. The London and Paris houses continued operating but on dramatically smaller scales. And M. Rothschild and Sons in London specialized in corporate advisory work and precious metals trading. The firm remained independent but handled a fraction of the business it had controlled in the 19th century. The Paris house, rebuilt after the war, followed a similar trajectory. In 1982, French President François Mitterrand's socialist government nationalized the French Rothschild Bank, along with dozens of other financial institutions. The family fought the action, but lost. When the bank was privatized again in 1987, the Rothschilds bought it back and renamed it Rothschild and CA Bank. The interruption had been brief but symbolically devastating. The family the governments had once needed was now subject to government decisions. Modern banking had evolved beyond what the original five brothers would recognize. Multinational corporations like J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs operated at scales that dwarfed even the 19th century Rothschild empire. They employed thousands, managed trillions, and coordinated across dozens of countries. What had made the Rothschilds exceptional? International coordination, information networks, relationship banking had become standard practice. The family dispersed across professions and continents. Some remained in finance. Others entered politics, science, wine production, or philanthropy. Baron Jacob Rothschild became known for arts patronage and historic preservation. Baron David de Rothschild managed the French banking operations. Baron Nathaniel Rothschild focused on finance and environmental conservation. The unity that had defined the family for 5 generations fractured into individual pursuits. The art collection suffered particularly devastating losses. Pieces stolen by the Nazis remained missing decades after the war. Some surfaced in museum collections or private hands, triggering legal battles over restitution. The Rothschilds recovered selected works through lengthy court proceedings, but thousands of items remained lost. Museums in Vienna, Berlin, and elsewhere held paintings with murky provenance, unable or unwilling to acknowledge they had been stolen from Jewish families. The human cost extended beyond property. Family members who survived the war carried trauma that shaped subsequent generations. Those who had fled Europe often never returned. Communities of employees who had worked in the Vienna palaces or the Frankfurt house were scattered or destroyed. The social networks that had supported the banking empire for a century simply ceased to exist. By the 1990s, when the Cold War ended and European integration accelerated, the Rothschild name carried more historical weight than contemporary power. The family remained wealthy by any standard. Collective assets ran into billions. But the fortune was dispersed across hundreds of family members and trusts. No single individual or branch controlled resources comparable to what Baron Lionel or Baron James had commanded. The transformation was forced, not chosen. World War II had destroyed the infrastructure that made coordination possible. Post-war regulation had made the old practices illegal or impractical. The rise of institutional banking had created competitors who operated at scales the family could not match. The dispersal of wealth across generations had prevented any individual from accumulating the concentration of capital that had made 19th century operations possible. What survived was memory and architecture. The mansions that remained, Waddesdon, Ferrières, scattered properties across Europe, testified to what the family had been. They were beautiful, meticulously maintained, and utterly disconnected from the business empire that had built them. Tour guides described the art and architecture. They rarely mentioned the telegraph rooms, or the intelligence networks, or the decades of coordination that had made the beauty possible. The family had survived. The empire they had built was gone, transformed into something that bore their name, but operated according to rules their ancestors would not recognize. The mansions that remained stand as monuments. But monuments to what? The tour bus winds through Buckinghamshire countryside, past farms and villages that have barely changed in a century. Visitors arriving at Waddesdon Manor see the chateau rising from its hilltop exactly as Baron Ferdinand intended when he built it in the 1880s. Golden bath stone glows in afternoon light. Turrets and towers echo French Renaissance architecture. The formal gardens descend in geometric precision toward parkland that extends for miles. A guide greets visitors at the entrance and begins the scripted tour. Waddesdon Manor was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild between 1874 and 1883. The architect was Gabriel Hippolyte d'Estailleur, who specialized in French chateau design. The house contains one of the finest collections of French decorative arts in England. What the guide rarely mentions could fill a separate book. The National Trust has operated Waddesdon since 1957, when Baron James de Rothschild bequeathed it with an endowment for maintenance. The organization preserves the mansion exactly as the family arranged it, maintaining furniture, paintings, porcelain, and objects in their original positions. Tours run from March through December, bringing more than 300,000 visitors annually to see how Victorian wealth expressed itself through architecture and collecting. The state rooms reveal the scale of Rothschild ambitions. The Red Drawing Room displays Savonnerie carpets commissioned for Louis XIV and furniture that once graced Versailles. The Tower Drawing Room contains Sèvres porcelain from the 18th century arranged in glass-fronted cabinets that cover entire walls. The Great Drawing Room holds paintings by Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Romney, alongside Renaissance portraits and Dutch masters. Each room demonstrates not just wealth, but sophisticated taste. Baron Ferdinand collected strategically, focusing on French decorative arts from the 18th century when French craftsmanship reached its peak. He purchased complete interiors from demolished Parisian mansions, shipping boiserie panels and carved woodwork to England where they were reassembled in Waddesdon's rooms. The tour guides emphasize aesthetic achievement. They describe the craftsmanship of furniture makers, the techniques of porcelain manufacturers, the provenance of individual paintings. They explain how Baron Ferdinand created a synthesis of French elegance and English country house tradition. They note architectural details, garden design, and the logistics of constructing a Loire Valley chateau on a Buckinghamshire hilltop. What they omit is how these rooms functioned when the family lived here. The Red Drawing Room, where tour groups now admire 18th century furniture, hosted weekend parties where prime ministers sat beside railway magnates and banking rivals. The conversations that took place on those Savonnerie carpets shaped government loan policies and corporate mergers. The beauty was real. The business conducted beneath it was equally significant. The ground floor contains rooms that reveal more if you know what to look for. A small study near Baron Ferdinand's private apartments has been preserved with its original desk, correspondence files, and a telephone installed in 1890, one of the earliest private lines in rural England. The study connects to a hallway that leads to what is now described as a service corridor. That corridor once contained the telegraph office. The equipment has been removed. The room now holds storage for the gift shop, but photographs from the 1890s show the space equipped with telegraph apparatus, code books, and filing cabinets for incoming messages. This was where information arrived from London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. This was where encrypted messages were decoded and urgent communications prepared for dispatch to banking offices. The National Trust does not emphasize this history. Their mission is preservation of architecture and decorative arts, not documentation of financial networks. But the infrastructure remains visible to anyone who examines the building systematically. Wiring conduits that once carried telegraph lines still run through walls. The basement contains rooms that clearly served purposes beyond household management. A door near the wine cellars opens to a tunnel that connects to the stable block, allowing discreet movement of documents and personnel. The gardens tell similar stories. The formal terraces, designed by landscape architect Élie Lainé, descend the hillside in Italianate splendor. Fountains, statuary, and precisely clipped hedges create outdoor rooms suitable for entertaining hundreds of guests. Tour groups photograph the Triton and Nereides fountain, the aviary designed like a Rococo palace, and the vista toward the Chiltern Hills. What made these gardens functional rather than merely decorative was their layout for discreet conversations. The paths wind through planted areas that provide visual barriers. Two people walking and talking could not be overheard from adjacent paths. During weekend parties, these gardens facilitated exactly the kind of private discussions that ministers and bakers required. The wine cellars remain operational, now serving the Waddesdon estate's own wine production and tasting rooms. Visitors can sample wines while surrounded by racks that once held 15,000 bottles of French vintages. The cellars extend beneath the house in a network of vaulted rooms that were engineered with the same precision as any other aspect of the estate. One room in the cellars, now used for storage, has walls lined with slate. Archives indicate this was a secure filing room where sensitive documents were kept in fireproof conditions. The room has no windows and only one entrance. During the family's residence, it required keys that only senior household staff possessed. At Ferrières, the transformation is more complete and more commercial. The chateau operates as an event venue managed by the University of Paris. Corporate. Clients rent it for conferences and retreats. Wedding parties book it for receptions. The staterooms that Napoleon III toured now host product launches and gala dinners. A visit to Ferrières requires advance booking and often coincides with private events. Tours cover the main architectural features, the central hall rising 60 feet beneath its glazed dome, the state apartments with their carved oak paneling, the gardens extending across hundreds of acres. The guides emphasize Baron James de Rothschild's creation of a Renaissance chateau that rivaled Versailles. What they rarely discuss is the chateau's occupation by German forces during World War II, or its function as a financial nerve center for 5 decades before that. The rooms are beautiful and historically significant as examples of 19th century architecture. The business empire they housed exists now only in archives. The Vienna palaces that survived demolition have been repurposed completely. The few remaining Rothschild properties operate as offices, embassies, or institutional headquarters. Visitors cannot tour them. The family presence in Vienna, once expressed through multiple grand residences, has been reduced to historical markers and street names. In London, the Rothschild banking house still operates from New Court in the financial district. The firm remains independent and family-controlled, specializing in corporate advisory work and wealth management. But the mansion at 148 Piccadilly, where Baron Lionel lived and conducted business, was demolished in 1937. Modern offices replaced it. The physical connection between residence and banking operations was severed decades ago. The mansions that remain preserved, primarily Waddesdon and Ferrières, function as monuments to an era when private wealth could be expressed through architecture on a scale that rivaled governments. They demonstrate sophisticated taste, extraordinary collecting, and the ambition to create permanent legacies. Tour groups leave impressed by the beauty and the scale. What the preservation omits is the machinery. The telegraph wires are gone. The couriers no longer arrive. The guest list no longer shape government policy. The art no longer functions as portable collateral. The gardens host tourists rather than politicians. The mansions endure as stone and glass. The empire they housed is harder to find. The name Rothschild still exists. The empire does not. Rothschild & Co., the modern banking group descended from the original family operations, reported market capitalization of approximately $3.5 billion in 2023. The figure represents significant wealth by most standards. Compare it to J.P. Morgan Chase's market cap exceeding $500 billion, or Goldman Sachs at $130 billion, and the scale becomes clear. What once dominated European finance now operates as a mid-sized advisory firm. The family members scattered across professions and continents number more than 300 descendants of Mayor Amschel Rothschild. Collective family wealth is estimated in the billions, but dispersed across hundreds of trusts, foundations, and individual holdings. No single branch controls resources comparable to what Baron Lionel or Baron James commanded at the height of the 19th century empire. Baron David de Rothschild served as chairman of Rothschild & Co. until 2018, maintaining family leadership of the banking operations. His son Alexandra now holds senior positions in the firm. The London and Paris houses continue operating, specializing in merger and acquisition advisory, wealth management, and strategic counsel to governments and corporations. The work is profitable and prestigious. It is not the foundation of international finance. The most visible Rothschild enterprise may be wine. Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Chateau Mouton. Rothschild in Bordeaux remain family-owned and produce some of the world's most expensive wines. Bottles from exceptional vintages sell for thousands of dollars. The estates employ hundreds and generate substantial revenue, but wine production is lifestyle business elevated to luxury scale, not the coordination of international capital flows that built the original empire. Baron Jacob Rothschild, who died in 2024, devoted his later decades to arts patronage and historic preservation. He chaired the National Gallery and the National Heritage Memorial Fund. He supervised restoration of Spencer House in London and supported numerous cultural institutions. His philanthropy continued patterns established by earlier generations, directing wealth toward preservation and education rather than consumption. Other family members entered politics, science, environmental conservation, and finance outside the family firm. The unity that had defined 5 generations, where every member's career advanced the collective enterprise, fragmented into individual pursuits. This was both liberation and loss. Descendants could choose their own paths without pressure to serve family business interests. But the coordination that had made the family exceptional became impossible to maintain. The institutional legacy extends beyond banking. Techniques that the Rothschilds pioneered became standard practice in modern finance. International coordination across borders, relationship banking, intelligence gathering from multiple sources, using social connections to facilitate business transactions. These are now routine operations for any global financial institution. The private telegraph network that gave the family hours of advantage over competitors evolved into Bloomberg terminals and encrypted communication systems that every major bank deploys. The weekend parties where ministers and bankers negotiated became industry conferences and private equity retreats, where deals are still structured informally, before formal announcements. The art collections that functioned as liquid reserves became diversified portfolios that served similar functions. What made the Rothschilds exceptional in 1850 had become ordinary by 1950 and standard by 2000. The communities that depended on Rothschild operations experienced their own transformations. Towns near Waddesdon and Ferrières that once supplied servants, goods, and services to the estates adjusted when the families departed. Some businesses disappeared. Others adapted to serving tourism rather than private households. The economic relationships that had sustained these communities for decades vanished within a generation. Competitors who had been crushed never rebuilt. The banking houses that the Rothschilds absorbed or destroyed in the 19th century, dozens of regional firms across Europe, left no institutional descendants. Their names survive only in historical records. The financial consolidation that began with the Rothschilds continued through the 20th century, creating the multinational banks that dominate today. But the specific firms that lost to Rothschild competition remain lost. The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that weaponized real Rothschild practices persist and mutate. Modern versions claim the family controls central banks, manipulates currencies, or directs world governments through secret influence. These theories ignore the documented dispersal of family wealth and the documented rise of institutional banking that dwarfs any private fortune. They ignore the fact that the coordination that made the family powerful in 1850 has been illegal or impractical since 1945. But conspiracy theories require no evidence. They fill psychological needs that facts cannot address. The Rothschild name remains a shorthand for hidden power, even as the actual family operates primarily in public markets through regulated institutions subject to government oversight. The question that remains is not whether the Rothschilds were powerful, they were, but what their power created and what it cost. The mansions are beautiful. Tour guides at Waddesdon describe Baron Ferdinand's exquisite taste and Baron James's generous bequest to the National Trust. They are correct on both counts. The chateau is aesthetically magnificent. The donation ensures its preservation. The system that built Waddesdon concentrated wealth through methods that eliminated alternatives. Competitors who could not match Rothschild coordination failed. Governments that needed loans accepted terms that gave the family political leverage. The beauty and the extraction were not separate phenomena. They were linked aspects of the same enterprise. Modern visitors photograph Sèvres porcelain and admire French furniture. The tours do not explain that some of these objects were purchased with profits from government bonds issued during wars that killed hundreds of thousands. The connection between art and its financing remains invisible, politely omitted from guided tours that emphasize aesthetic achievement. The same ambiguity applies to institutional legacies. The Rockefeller Foundation eradicated hookworm and developed yellow fever vaccines, saving millions of lives. The Rothschilds funded railways that connected European cities and facilitated commerce that raised living standards. Both families built universities and supported medical research. Both directed unprecedented sums toward public benefit. Both fortunes originated in practices that would be illegal under modern antitrust law, labor regulation, and financial oversight. The good that came from the wealth does not erase how it was accumulated. The suffering caused by monopolistic practices is not cancelled by subsequent philanthropy. Perhaps the most honest assessment acknowledges both realities simultaneously. The Rothschild banking empire demonstrated that private coordination across national borders could achieve what governments struggled to accomplish. It financed infrastructure, stabilized currencies during crises, and created systems that evolved into modern international finance. It also concentrated enormous power in unaccountable private hands, eliminated competitors through methods that bordered on predatory, and operated in legal gray areas that governments proved unable or unwilling to regulate effectively. The mansions embody this duality. They are genuine architectural achievements that deserve preservation. They are also monuments to a system that enriched one family while shaping European economics and politics for generations without democratic oversight. Standing at Waddesdon today, looking out over Buckinghamshire countryside that has changed little since Baron Ferdinand's time, visitors see beauty maintained at extraordinary cost. The estate requires millions annually for upkeep. The National Trust employs dozens of staff. The gardens demand constant attention. The art collection needs climate control and security. All of this preservation serves to maintain a monument to wealth that no longer exists in the form that created it. The telegraph rooms are silent. The couriers no longer arrive. The ministers who once negotiated over brandy are long dead. What remains is architecture and objects.